כעת אני מתכבדת להזמין את עורכת המהדורה הבינלאומית של הג'רוזלם פוסט ובעלת טור ליאת קולינס להציג את מרצה האורח שלנו הערב, פרופסור אלן דרשוויץ, ולקיים איתו שיחה על הנושאים הבוערים בהוויה היהודית והישראלית היום. אני מזמינה את שניכם לבמה.
Being here together with Professor Alan Dershowitz is no less of an honor and also, I assume, going to be a challenge to a certain extent. One of the challenges I got actually was when they invited me to speak with you and discuss the issues of the day with you and introduce you. They told me I have 30 minutes and then gave me your biography. I thought, well, that will take the first 15 or so. You have, of course, I don't even know if I really need to do an introduction to Professor Alan Dershowitz, but just in case, you've been called lots of things. Some of them we might discuss later on. Not all are publishable. Among the very flattering things are the most distinguished defenders of individual rights, the best-known criminal lawyer in the world, the top lawyer of last resort, America's most public jurist defender, and Israel's most visible defender, the Jewish state's lead attorney in the court of public opinion. He got a prize from the Anti-Defamation League of Brit, the William O. Douglas First Amendment Award, for his compassionate, eloquent leadership and persistent advocacy in struggle of human and civil rights. And in presenting the award, Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel said, if there had been a few people like Alan Dershowitz during the 1930s and 1940s, the history of European Jewry might have been different. So any more introduction than that I don't really need. He literally wrote the book. He didn't, literally in the sense of actually several books he wrote on the subject. The Case for Israel is probably his best known. Last year you wrote on the terror tunnels, the case for Israel's just war against Hamas. And I understand you've just got a new one coming out now. Abraham, the world's first and definitely not last Jewish lawyer. Mm-hmm. So we've got that bit over. And obviously the top question, I think, in the mind of everybody here, and the evening has such a serious side to it as well as being fun, the question of the growth of anti-Semitism and BDS. And there's been so much in the news lately about it. The British Union of Students vote, the FIFA vote that didn't come to actually be discussed eventually, but even the fact that it was raised obviously was a threat. The statement by the Orange head and so on. Mm-hmm. And my question actually is, can you put this in some kind of context and proportion? Are we exaggerating in our response to it as a threat?
No, I don't think so. I think it's a very serious threat. Before I explain why, let me first thank you for inviting me here today. I am a tremendous fan of the B'nai B'rith. My father was a member of B'nai B'rith Lodge. It is the oldest Jewish organization in the United States and the first to establish a presence in Israel. It does just remarkable work all over the world, and it is such an honor and a pleasure for me to be in any way identified with this great and marvelous organization. Now to BDS. The problem is not the concept of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. We all approve of that concept in some contexts. Many of us in this room would like to continue to see sanctions and boycotts directed against the Iranian regime. The United States had boycotts and divestments against Cuba when Castro took over and murdered so many people. There are many countries in the world that might appropriately be subject to BDS. China for its occupation of Tibet for many more years, and
yet we held the
with
Olympics
far less justification than Israel's continued military presence on the West Bank. Turkey, recently with the anti-Semitic statements of its president, who fortunately did not get a majority in the most recent election. One could go down the list and probably name 150 countries that deserve to be boycotted, divested from, and sanctioned before one even begins to pronounce the word Israel. So the issue is not BDS, the issue is the singularity of directing that sanction against the most democratic state in the Middle East, one of the most democratic states in the world. And when I debate BDS, I always throw out the following challenge to my students all over the world. Name a single country in the history of the world, a single country, faced with threats, internal and external, comparable to those faced by Israel, that has ever had a better record of human rights, a better record of compliance with the rule of law, a better record of concern for civilians. And I've been asking that question now for 20 years, probably to 1 million people around the world. I've never gotten a single person even to stand up and name a country, because you can't do it. And any country you name, one can show that there is no better record. Is Israel perfect? Of course not. Were I an Israeli citizen, I'd feel perfectly entitled to be critical of Israel's policies in many regards, as I am very critical of America's policies. But to be critical of a country's policies is not to demand the unique kind of moral capital punishment of BDS.
So what has changed now? Why is this? I mean, are we just overreacting, or has something changed?
Something has changed. Something has changed, and that, I think, is that the anti-Israel sentiment and those who advocate it around the world have increased their sophistication. They've come onto college campuses with Apartheid Week, etc. And I think the pro-Israel advocates have not done enough to prove and demonstrate that those who support BDS, not only on the wrong side of morality, but on the wrong side of the peace process. BDS is antagonistic to peace. It makes it harder for the Palestinians to come to the bargaining table. It is no coincidence that as the BDS process has grown, the Palestinians have become more and more reluctant to come back to the negotiating table and have imposed more and more preconditions because they think they don't have to negotiate a two-state solution. They are prepared to go to international communities, to count on BDS, and to ask others to do the job. For example, if the Security Council were to pass the French proposal, it would essentially demand the establishment of a two-state solution without demanding anything of the Palestinians, without demanding that they give up the right of return, without demanding that they accept Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people. And so I understand why the Palestinians are not coming back to the negotiating table, and it's in large part because of the BDS movements and the attempt to internationalize the conflict in front of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and the Security Council.
So is this moving on from lawfare to politicide?
Well, yeah, and it does move the process, and lawfare has been quite successful. And that's why I think it's very important to take this campaign seriously. By the way, those of you in the room who think that, and there are many Israelis who think BDS is a good thing because it will accomplish what they have failed to accomplish electorally. In a democracy, you don't go outside the country to achieve what you can't achieve inside the country democratically. And there are some who think that it will help bring about a two-state solution. They're just wrong. They're just wrong. The BDS movement is making it far more difficult to bring about a two-state solution. And so, I think that while criticism of Israel is occasionally warranted, and I'm not averse to criticizing Israel when I think it's wrong, or Israeli leaders who I think make mistakes, the idea of uniquely demonizing Israel makes it much harder to bring about a reasonable, peaceful solution. The big problem on campuses today is you do not get nuanced discussions. You do not get calibrated, reasonable, intellectual discussions about Israel-Palestine, about the Middle East peace process. It's all slogan tossing. It's all how many condemnations can you make? Israel is the worst. Israel is this, that, the other thing. And you don't get reasonable conversation and discussion.
Do you think the next generation, the generation that is now on campus and is growing up in this atmosphere, is going to be affected in the long term?
I have no doubt about it. It's not only the coming generation. I think even the generation represented by President Obama does not have the same kind of feeling for Israel that even one earlier generation, the generation represented by President Clinton and George W. Bush, had toward Israel, or Ronald Reagan had toward Israel. So I think we are seeing a generational issue. Now, let me be very clear and give you some optimistic news. The vast majority of American college students certainly don't favor BDS, and they don't oppose Israel. I think they're critical of the occupation. They may not understand the concept of occupation, military occupations, are justified under international law until belligerency ceases. Israel, for example, had a perfect right to maintain military occupation in the Gaza. Legally, it made a political decision not to do that. There's an enormous legal distinction between military occupation and civilian settlements. Civilian settlements have a much more questionable status under international law. But nobody can point me to a case that says, or any international law principle that says that Israel is not entitled to maintain a military presence in the West Bank as long as there is a significant military threat, which we know exists, not only through Hamas potentially increasing their visibility on the West Bank, but possibility of ISIS or ISIS surrogates coming in as well. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about the legal status as well as the political situation.
You have been critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu's stand on the settlements. Can you actually say that the settlements then are illegal, the civil settlements?
Well, I've been critical of every Prime Minister of Israel's stance on the settlements. I wrote my first piece in 1973 where I opposed the establishment of the settlement of Elan Moreh. And my rabbi in the Young Israel Borough Park called me a traitor to the Jewish people in front of my parents during a Rosh Hashanah sermon. So I have a long history of being critical of Israel's settlement policy. I don't limit it to any particular government. Remember, the settlement policies were begun under the Labor government. And when President Obama ignorantly proclaims, oh, he was a real fan of Israel when Golda Meir was the prime minister, he has no idea what he's talking about. He doesn't know that Golda Meir was one of the strongest opponents of Palestinian statehood, indeed of Palestinian peoplehood. The President of the United States, tragically, is an ignoramus when it comes to Israel's history and has many of the wrong principles. I supported President Obama twice. I support his domestic policies. I support his position on gay rights, his position on a woman's right to choose abortion, on health care, on gun control, on separation of church and state, and on a range of issues. But and I support his support of Israel for an Iron Dome and his support of Israel in its attempts to defend its civilians against Gaza. I encouraged him to go to Sderot when he was running for president, and he made that excellent statement about if rockets were being sent at my children's home, I would do everything in my power to prevent it, and Israel, we expect, would do the same thing. But he's making a tragic, tragic mistake on Iran, and today's Supreme Court decision will embolden him in saying that the president has the sole authority to make foreign policy decisions, and Congress has no role to play in making these decisions. And I think we're going to see a very, very bad deal emerge. Now, the good news is the deal will not be confirmed by the Senate. It will not be a treaty. Therefore, it will not have the force of law. And any subsequent president, when she comes to office, or he comes to office, will have the power to modify, rescind. For example, I have urged Hillary Clinton, who I've known for many, many years, to, if she becomes the president, when she announces, when she becomes a strong candidate, to indicate that 10 years from now, it may not be clear that there should be a sunset provision to any deal, that Iran should earn its right to a sunset provision by giving up its role as the greatest purveyor of international terrorism in the world, of essentially an occupier of Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, attempts at other countries, and stop calling for saying the destruction of Israel is a non-negotiable demand. If Iran does not end those three illegal demands and illegal actions, it should not be entitled to a sunset provision. And I think a president of the United States would be within his or her power to not grant that part of the deal final status unless Iran complies with its obligations under the rule of law.
Last month, a couple of weeks ago, you wrote a piece in the Jerusalem Post saying that Obama is neither anti-Israel nor anti-Jewish.
That's right.
And yet, and yesterday we saw the Jerusalem Post conference in New York. Unfortunately, terrible hacking of the Treasury, the U.S. Secretary of Treasury. And you yourself have also been heckled there in the past, I understand. So why is it then that there's this divide, this disconnect? If you're saying Obama certainly sees himself or says that he sees himself as pro-Israel and in favor of the Jewish people. He seems to identify with the Jewish people. Why is it then that we have this disconnect between the Israeli feeling and feeling apparently also among American Jews to a certain extent, that this is not a friendly administration?
To a certain extent. Of course, 70% of American Jews voted for Obama in the second election and 73 or 4% in the first election.
They're probably not all happy with
Well,
him.
no, I'm not happy with it. And there are many who probably would reconsider that vote if it happened today. Because the question is what you prioritize, foreign affairs or domestic affairs, and that's a fair question. Look, for right-wing Republicans, it's an easy choice. They don't like his position on gun control. They don't like his position on health care. They don't like his position on anything. That's easy. For radical anti-Israel left-wingers, it's easy. They like his position on Israel. They like his positions on other things. For many, many American Jews and supporters of Israel like me, it's much more complicated. We support his domestic program. We could never support a Republican domestic program. If we were in Britain, we could be conservatives because they support gay rights. They're opposed to the death penalty. They're more like Israel. Conservatives in Israel, many conservatives in Israel don't take issue with some of the social policies. But in America, it's very hard. I almost wrote a book, I may do it someday, called Why I Left the Left But Couldn't Join the Right. And many American supporters of Israel, many American Jews are without a home politically. But the reason I will not ever again speak at the Jerusalem Post conference, even though I am a contributor to the Jerusalem Post, is not because of the Jerusalem Post, but because of the audiences that it attracts. It attracts right-wing extremists, some racists, some bigots that come to these conferences and do not behave appropriately. And the Jerusalem Post, obviously believes in freedom of speech. So do I. But I also have the right to decide which audiences I'm going to speak in front of, and I will not speak again at a Jerusalem Post audience that boos the President of the United States. I don't care whether the President of the United States is a Republican or a Democrat. I was in an event in Florida. It's the question of the office. I was in an event in Florida not so long ago where I was supporting Israel, and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who is the head of the Democratic Party, said something positive about Obama's domestic policies or something, and she got roundly booed every time she mentioned the word Obama. And I stood up.
The paper did condemn this, of course.
And I stood up and I said, look, whatever you think of the president's views, it is not appropriate for an audience of Jewish pro-Israel supporters to boo the president of the United States in that manner every time his name is mentioned. And yes, the paper condemned that. I had told the newspaper previously, because they did the same thing with me. Anytime I mentioned the two-state solution, I got booed. Anytime I mentioned the settlements, I got booed. Anytime Ehud Olmert, who was speaking at the same time, mentioned his efforts to bring about peace with the Palestinians, he got booed. That is not representative of the United States. These are people who sit in their cushy homes in suburban New York, whose children are not in harm's way, who are themselves not in harm's way, who contribute $25 a year to the UJA and think they have the right to tell Israel what policies to pursue.
Maybe that's part
Israel is a democracy, and it is. And whether you agree with a particular result or not, Israel's democratic processes must be respected.
Maybe this is part of the whole culture that you were talking about before. The culture that we see on campus also, where it's almost like people don't want to learn and don't want to hear the other side. I mean,
there is no subject that is discussed more ignorantly than the subject of Israel, Palestine, the Middle East. And I'm not talking about students. I'm talking about professors in the classroom. You cannot imagine what blither is taught under the auspices of academic freedom. On both sides, on all sides. There is almost no possibility of having a nuanced conversation or discussion. I'll tell you an interesting story. I know we have to run through, but this is an interesting story. A student at Harvard Law School decided to take a class with a professor named Duncan Kennedy. Now, Duncan Kennedy is a contracts professor. He knows nothing about the Middle East, but he's a hard leftist. And when you're a hard leftist, you must teach a course on Israel-Palestine. Otherwise, you'll be kicked out of the hard left, even though you know nothing about it. And so he decided to teach that course, and he created a syllabus which just contained extremist, political, ideological, anti-Israel views. So one of my students, Joel Pollack, said he wanted to take the class, but he went to the professor and said, I think you should include some more balanced presentations, not pro-Israel presentations, just more balanced presentations. And Duncan Kennedy said, it's my course. I'll have the students read what I want. And Joel Pollack looked him in the eye and said, it's not your course. It's the university's course. I'm creating an online alternative syllabus, and I'm going to give the students an opportunity to read a more balanced presentation. And he did that. And by the end of the semester, more students were reading Joel Pollak's syllabus than the professor's syllabus. Now, I'm not sure what grade he got in the course, but he didn't care. And that's the way to combat this misuse of academic freedom to use the classroom to propagandize.
The question is actually how you can combat it. Several years ago, Yair Lapid, before he went into politics, when he was still a journalist, suggested that we mobilize Jewish lawyers around the world, named you, obviously, and Irene Kotler, for example, also. Is the legal recourse the best way of attacking or tackling such problems? Or
No, I don't think legal recourse is almost ever the best way, saying this as a lawyer, to solve problems. It's a mechanism of last resort. Generally, we have to win in the court of public opinion. And it's important.
So how would you do
Well,
do
first
that?
of all, we have to be better at it, and we have to be smarter at it. Pro-Israel advocacy should not be part of the Israeli government. It should be independent of the government. If it's going to be in any government office, it should be in the office of the president, not in the office of the foreign ministry or the prime minister. The job of pro-Israel advocacy is not to support any particular government's position. It's to support what I call the 80% case for Israel, the case that the vast majority of Israelis agree to on a consensus, and to make it united, not divided. And the difference between, for example, me and J Street is I go on college campus and I emphasize the 80% where everybody agrees, and J Street goes on campuses and focuses on the 20%, where there is understandable disagreement, as there would be in any democracy. And I think Israel has to be smarter about how it deals with its campaign in the court of public opinion, because it can win a battle on the battlefield and lose it in front of the UN, in front of students, and for the future.
The meeting this week between Chaim Saban and Sheldon Adelson, for example.
I was invited to that meeting, and unfortunately, or fortunately, I was here with my granddaughter, and that trumps everything.
But couldn't that also be misused and abused and turned against Israel as another sign that the Jews are funding?
Look, I think Jewish power. There's this joke, tragic joke that in 1932. Two Jews were sitting at a cafe in Vienna, and one of them is reading the pro-Israel, pro-Jewish newspaper, and the other one is reading Der Stürmer. And the Jew is reading the Jewish newspaper. Why are you reading that Nazi rag? He says, look, I used to always read the Jewish press. All I read about is pogroms and how terrible it is for the Jews. Now I read the Der Stürmer. The Jews control the banks. They control the media. It makes me feel good. It's a terrible story, but to the extent that Jews, in fact, or pro-Israel groups have power, it must be used. Hashem oz li'amo yitain. God will give the Jewish people strength, and only then will there be peace. Strength is absolutely essential. I think we've learned the lesson of the Shoah, that morality is not enough. Mahatma Gandhi said that Jews didn't have to fight back. They were on the right side of morality. It didn't do any good at all. Others also made that point. Unfortunately, history has shown that uniquely Jews need power, strength, political, moral, military, economic, academic, and all of that strength should be used. So God bless Sheldon Adelson. God bless Chaim Saban. Let them support this financially. However, we should not make the fiddler on the roof mistake, thinking, if you're rich, they think you really know. There have to be some not-so-rich people added to the mix to provide the kind of balance and intellectual and moral support to this. Elie Wiesel does a great job in doing that. So does Erwin Cutler. I try my best. Others try our best, too. And we have to continue the fight. And it's not easy because I'm going to take a minute just to explain something here. There's an enormous difference between my generation, my granddaughter's generation, my children's generation. I grew up right after the Holocaust. I was born in 1938. I grew up in Brooklyn to a family of strongly religious Zionists. We didn't see any incompatibility between our liberal democratic leanings, our Zionist leanings, our religious attitudes. I grew up with a grandfather who had helped rescue more than 20 of his family members from the Shoah in Brno, Czechoslovakia. I grew up with a father who taught me tzedek tzedek tirdof, which was my bar mitzvah sedra, and taught me that you always defend the underdog. I'm here tonight with my uncle Zachariah Dershowitz, who was an important influence in my life. He not only taught me how to swim, but he taught me morality and justice. Ironically, I went to an air base today, only in Israel. I went to an air base, and my granddaughter was allowed to climb into the cockpit of an F-15. Every F-15 has a name. You'll never believe what the name of the F-15 that we were allowed to go into was. Tzedek. What other country in the world would have an airplane capable of dealing death, capable of defending, called Tzedek? The idea that justice controls the use of military force is something that one wishes more countries in the world would subscribe to. So I was very lucky. I grew up in a generation where some of my classmates had tattoos, or their parents had tattooed numbers on their arms. I witnessed 1948, 1967. I was a young assistant professor in 1967 when it looked like Israel could be really defeated militarily. But my children and grandchildren have a very different experience. My children's memories of Israel start with the Lebanon wars. My grandchildren's memory of Israel starts with the BDS and with complaints about the occupation. It was much easier for my generation. It's much harder for my granddaughter's generation and for my children's and for my students' generation. And that's why we have a very, very difficult job ahead of us, and we have to face that challenge.
And not just a generation, maybe to what extent do you think people abroad can actually understand the Israeli reality? Obviously last summer was the prize example with just about everybody I know at some point rather ran from a missile attack, a rocket attack, and the threat of the terror tunnels is devastating, that all of a sudden you think a tunnel can appear underneath, literally the monster under your bed, under your kid's bed. It exists.
Well, the way to change people's minds is to bring them to Israel. I think Operation Birthright has just done marvelous had effect on many college students. They come here to have a good time, but they can't help but see the reality. I brought my granddaughter here. She graduated from Harvard College last week, and this was kind of her graduation gift. But I think what she's seen, the idea that you walk around Sderot and you not only have to look up, but you have to look down. And that every minute of your life is dominated by being within 10 seconds of a shelter. And to see that you have to play as if you're a kid indoors, and you have to cancel soccer matches, and you can't have dances. I saw one of the most poignant things. What I saw is that the Karen Kayemet built a room, a bar mitzvah room. A birthday room. It just said Yom Huledet Sameach, because the kids in Sderot, many of them were 8, 10 years old. They had never had a birthday party because parents don't feel comfortable inviting 8 or 10 kids to a home that doesn't have sufficient shelter for 8 or 10 kids. The idea that children don't have birthday parties because terrorists are committing double war crimes by sending rockets from behind civilian shields at civilians, causing this kind of devastation. And the world doesn't understand. On college campuses, you hear only a small number of Israelis were killed. They don't mention that maybe 1 million are suffering from PTS as the result of living their lives under an umbrella of terrorist rockets and for fear of terrorist tunnels. And they don't understand the concept of proportionality. Proportionality doesn't mean that the same number of Israelis as Palestinians have to be killed. Disproportionate force in trying to prevent terrorism is fair. The only meaning that proportionality has in law is that when you pick a military target, the value of the military target has to be proportionate to the anticipated civilian casualties, and you have to minimize the potential civilian casualties, which Israel does by sending out messages, by the knocking bombs on the roof, by all the actions it takes. We were today with a drone commander who was sitting there and telling us that his job essentially is to call off military attacks because of the possibility that maybe a civilian will be in the area. And as he explained to us, every time he calls off an attack, that means more rockets will land, and they could land and hurt members of his own family or his friends. So doing nothing is an act that has enormous consequences. And all I want is for students and professors and people in positions of leadership to understand these are complex issues. You can disagree with how they're resolved, as long as you understand the nuance and the complexity and understand that every Israeli soldier and every Israeli commander is interested in minimizing civilian casualties, both for moral and tactical and political reasons. And the idea that a Goldstone report would actually say that Israel had a policy of increasing civilian casualties is such a modern-day blood libel, essentially, and yet some in the world agree with it. I mean, there's just no evidence to support that. And then for Human Rights Watch to say that there's no evidence that Hamas or Hezbollah uses human shields when it's right there in the literature of the Hamas.
And any rocket that's being fired at a civilian population in Israel is automatically a war crime.
And it's a double war crime if it's fired from civilian areas. And the other myth that I've exposed in my writing is that Gaza, I heard it yesterday, is the most crowded area on the face of the earth. Yeah, it has about a fifth the density of Tel Aviv. It's like a tenth the density of New York. And it has many, many, many areas that are open fields. And Hamas makes the military decision to fire its rockets from the densest areas rather than the least dense areas, because it knows that if it fire its rockets from where the law requires it to fire its rockets, namely open areas without the presence of civilians, Israel will have a military advantage. But having a military disadvantage is not a justification for committing a double war crime. And the world doesn't seem to understand that.
I think sometimes people also don't realize that Gaza has another border. It has a border with Egypt. It's not...
and at far less dense areas, if you look at a Google map around that area, you look at a Google map between Gaza City and some of the other areas, you see open areas. The worst excuse I was ever given when I debated this on television was that, oh, but they're farms owned by individuals and Gaza respects private property. Right. Uses private homes for launching rockets and building tunnels, but it won't use farms. But, people believe this kind of nonsense. And if you have a predisposition, an ideological predisposition to believe, you confabulate, you fill in the gaps by having the reality conform to your ideology, and it produces the lack or the absence of emet, truth.
This last question might actually be a brief one, but where do you get a ray of hope from? Where do you see positive events in the future?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons for looking at positives. It is in the interest of Israel. It is in the interest of the Palestinian Authority, to the extent it retains any power or authority over its constituents, and that's a real question. It is in the interest of everybody for there to be peace in the Middle East. There was a study today that showed that hundreds of billions of dollars would be added to both the Israeli and the Palestinian economy if some kind of peace could be achieved. That requires compromise. That requires each side giving up things that they believe are very important to them. Let me give you an example, which I know will get a lot of disagreement in this room, but might as well end with some controversy so you'll have something to talk about. Let's take the Israeli presence in Hebron. Okay, is there any place on the face of the earth that Jews have a right to live in more than in Hebron? I just wrote a book about Avraham, and I talk about 6 incidents in his life where he was a lawyer. Obviously, we all know the incident of Hashofet Kol Haaretz Lo Yaseh Mishpat, arguing with God over the sinners of Saddam. We know the story of when...
It's so Jewish to argue with God, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, but he doesn't always argue with God. And we know the next story where he fails to argue with God and should argue with God over the Akedah. And, of course, the last of the stories is Abraham buying a burial plot for his wife, who in life he mistreated pretty badly. He never said, hey, by the way, little Isaac, I'm taking him on a walk. He's your only child. He's not my only child. But I'm not even going to tell you about it. Not such a great role model as a husband. But he's terrific when she dies, and he buys a place for her to be buried, and he pays fair price for it. And he pays fair price so that the world will know in the future that this is territory that was bought by the Jewish people for the Jewish people on the orders of God. So, the Jewish right to be in Hebron is as strong as the Catholic Church's right to be in the Vatican or Muslims' right to be in Mecca and Medina. There's absolutely no question about that from any moral, biblical, historical point of view, nonetheless, I think it is right for Israel to make a decision to compromise that issue and to say that in the interest of peace, in the interest of pikuach nefesh, the saving of life, Jews should be allowed to live in Hebron, but not as part of Israel. And that's a decision that the Israeli people have to make, and it should be subject perhaps to a referendum. But if I were an Israeli, I would vote for that. It is said that Rabbi Soloveitchik, I've never seen the quote myself, said that if the choice were between recapturing the Kotel or giving up one life, perhaps the answer should be not to recapture the Kotel. That may be an extreme view, and I'm not sure I subscribe.
There's probably people in this room who remember having pulled out of Bethlehem, which we
Of
also
course.
have an undoubted right to be there in Jewish, from
Well,
a Jewish
but
perspective.
so do
too.
Christians have a right to live in Bethlehem.
The big response was the missiles. I'm sure people here remember the missiles on Gilgal.
No question. All I'm suggesting is this. Compromise is essential. Just because you have a right to something doesn't mean it's the right thing to insist on no compromise. The Palestinians may have a plausible claim for a right of return, just as the 800,000 Jews have a strong claim for a right of return or compensation from having been kicked out of Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria and Yemen and Iraq and Iran. On the other hand, essentially, that right has been surrendered. There was an exchange of population. The Palestinians must give up any claim to a right of return. Palestinians must give up other claims that they regard as plausible. Both sides have to compromise. And that's why BDS, ICC, all these terrible initials, UN, are not going to contribute in any way to the peace process. They're going to make it far more difficult. What is required is that the Palestinians give up any preconditions for coming back to the negotiating table. The Israelis give up preconditions. You can, in the end, negotiate that the Palestinians have to accept Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. It doesn't have to be a precondition. Sitting down and negotiating. Will it result in peace? I'm not particularly optimistic. The offer that was made by Ehud Barak and President Clinton in 2000-2001 was as generous an offer as any country has ever made to any other country. Yasser Arafat responded to that by not only saying no, but by starting the Intifada, causing 4,000 deaths, the blood of which is on the hands of Jimmy Carter because he urged Arafat not to accept Camp David and Ataba. Jimmy Carter may have been good on one Camp David, but he was awful on the other Camp David. And then Ehud Olmert offered peace as well, far more recently, and the Palestinians did not respond to that offer. Would the Palestinian leadership today, A, respond to a generous offer by the current government? Would the current government make a generous offer? These are hard questions. Could the Palestinian Authority?
Who is the leadership of
That's the question. Could they implement? Could they follow through? Would the end of some military presence in the West Bank result in a Hamas takeover? These are all very serious questions that deserve to be debated, but they can only be debated in the context of sitting down and seeing and negotiating. Now, the last person you want to have do your negotiation is Barack Obama. I would not allow Barack Obama to negotiate a one-month lease for me. He may be good at certain things, but he is a terrible, terrible negotiator. He's now said that the United States has a choice. Either accept this deal or the alternative will be much worse. It will end the sanctions and it will allow Iran to continue its nuclear program. President Obama may be right that the choices currently available to the world are both bad ones. One is bad and one is worse. But how did we get there? How did we get there? We didn't have the option of bad, worse 2 years ago. 2 years ago, it looked like it was good, better, best. But now we have worse, worser, worsest, and unbelievably unacceptable.
Maybe the initial mistake was not supporting the move against the Iranian regime when it came from within Iran before the Arab Spring.
There was a very serious mistake that the United States made. It's made it in more than one place where it encouraged some dissident movement and then it abandoned the dissident movement. I represent an organization, very controversial organization called the MEK, Mujahideen. We're a secular Islamic women-controlled group. Some people call it a cult. I've known the leaders now for quite a while. They are an alternative to the Iranian current regime. There are many alternatives. The United States is counting on some change occurring in the Iranian regime over the next 10 years. I think they're right to count on a change, but I think the change will be much for the worse. Because in Iran, which has been emboldened by winning, and they've won. They've won. If they get this deal, they've won. Number one. Number two, they're now going to become the major exporter of terrorism with a lot more money to spend on terrorism. If you think the Korean A, the boat that was captured with the weapons, is anything, wait till an Iranian regime without the financial burden of sanctions begins to export its terrorism, export its control over Hezbollah, export its influence in Syria, export its influence in Yemen. So I think the Iranian regime will change. I think the president's right. I think he's just dead wrong about the direction in which it will change. And I think that 10 years from now, we'll live in a world with nuclear proliferation, which is against the principles of the Obama administration. He will have encouraged the Saudis to obtain nuclear weapons, the Egyptians to maintain. Remember, today we wouldn't have strong objections to the Egyptians having nuclear weapons, but think back just how many months ago when the Egyptian regime was a different regime. 2 months from now, it could be a different regime. We're not talking about stable governments. We're talking about unstable governments. We're talking about non-governments like ISIS. This has become a more dangerous, not a less dangerous place over the last couple of years, and it requires will and determination. I'm going to end on a more optimistic note, and again, on a controversial note, because I know many of you in this room will disagree with me. I think there is no more appropriate time for Israel to try again very hard to make peace with the Palestinians, because if Israel makes peace with the Palestinians, it increases its leverage on Iran by being able to have closer cooperation with Saudi Arabia, with the Emirates, with other Arab countries. Right now, my enemy if my enemy is my friend is not enough to justify coordination. But I think if there could be some peace, with compromise, with some risks, because all peace comes with risks, I think the benefits from a security point of view of being able to combine more effectively against Iran and against the common enemies of Israel and the Palestinians. Remember, the Palestinians, if they do get some kind of a West Bank democracy, and that's a big, big, big if, would have as their greatest enemy ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah, and they would want some degree of stability and coordination with Israel. There are risks involved, but as I mentioned before, there are risks involved in inaction too. All I suggest is that these issues be debated in a rational way. I'm going to end with a quote from Bill Clinton. I was having dinner with him on Martha's Vineyard when he was the president of the United States. And we were sitting at a table with 6 or 7 people, and one of the other people in the table, a strong Jewish supporter, was condemning the Israeli government, particularly condemning the then prime minister, who's the current prime minister. And I started to respond. Bill Clinton put his hand on my knee and said, Alan, let me take this one. And he went after this guy and says, you don't have no idea about Israeli democracy. He says, I have a cabinet. I appoint my cabinet. If anybody in the cabinet looks at me funny, he's out. She's out. That cabinet is my cabinet. Do you have any idea what the Israeli cabinet is about? Every person in that cabinet is trying to destroy the career of the prime minister, trying to undercut him, trying to replace him. He said, it's so easy, the president said, for me to deal with Jordan. I pick up the phone. I call, it was then King Hussein. I say, hey, Hussein, do what I say. And Hussein has to do it. I call Mubarak, and I say, do what I say. He has to do it. I call the prime minister of Israel, and I say, do as I say. And the prime minister of Israel says, me? What power do I have? I have my cabinet. I have the Knesset. I'll try my best. Maybe I'll be able to do this. And so Bill Clinton ended up with a great statement. He looked this guy in the eye and he said, you know, Israel is a democracy, damn it. And for him, that was a curse because it made his life so much more difficult. But it's the greatest blessing in the world. Israel is a democracy. You get to decide its fate. You get to decide the risk ratio of your children going to war. You get to decide the risks involved in ending occupations, ending settlements. You get to decide all the risks. You're the voters. You're the ultimate sovereign of this country. Just be smart.
One minute. Before I'd like to thank Professor Dershowitz, and I'd like to thank Professor Dershowitz and B'nai B'rith for giving us this opportunity. And before we go, there's one question that I do want to ask you from this evening. As we are sitting in Jerusalem, relating to the American Supreme Court decision today on the standards of...
Okay, let me just briefly give the decision. The Supreme Court decision today was not particularly an intelligent decision. Let me tell you why. There was such an easy way of deciding the case on a narrow ground. The case did not present the issue of whether the United States should recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The case presented a very different issue. That is a person born in Jerusalem, born in the country of Israel? Is that a hard question? Of course a person born in Jerusalem is born in the country of Israel. The United States knows that. It has a consulate in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is part of Israel. It could have been a one-paragraph decision saying Congress passed a statute. All statutes passed by Congress are presumptively valid. We should interpret the statute in the narrowest possible way. The president can say whatever he wants about Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. He can do what other presidents have done, swear to recognize Jerusalem as the capital when you're running for office and then immediately change your mind when you're elected president. That's part of an American political reality. This case has nothing to do with that. And the president didn't have to say anything. Congress has already said simply that if you're born in Jerusalem, you are born in Israel. That is not a debatable proposition. And that's all the Supreme Court had to say. What is so tragic about today's decision is that they reached out to decide issues that they don't have to reach. They used very broad language, which will embolden the president to say, I have ultimate authority in making the deal with Iran. And Congress, which claims authority over the deal, has no such deal. It's a very different case because this deal, to me as a constitutional lawyer, sounds awfully much like a treaty. If it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, and walks like a duck, it's a duck. This looks like a treaty, it acts like a treaty, it should be deemed to be a treaty, and therefore Congress should have authority to either ratify the treaty or not ratify the treaty. It's like the president. The president could appoint Danny Grossman to become the ambassador to Israel if they want to. He'd be entitled to be the ambassador. But if the Senate doesn't approve of Danny Grossman, Danny doesn't become the ambassador. Presidents don't have authority to appoint ambassadors. They only have the authority to nominate ambassadors. Presidents don't have the authority to make treaties. They only have the authority to negotiate treaties. The authority is divided. And the idea that Congress can't say in simple language that a kid born in the geographical confines of the city of Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, remember this old concept goes beyond 1967. It applied from 48 on. So in 1963, a person born in West Jerusalem could not say that he was born in Israel. Did anybody not recognize at that point that West Jerusalem was part of Israel? It may not have been the capital according to the United States, but it was certainly part of Jerusalem. So this is a tragic decision. By the way, it's not a 6-3 decision, as was suggested by the press. There are only 4 justices who completely went along with the decision. Justice Thomas concurred in part, dissented in part. Justice Breyer said he would have decided the case on different grounds, that it's a political question, but since that has been not decided, he went along with the decision. And then 3 other justices wrote strong dissenting reports. So it's not completely 100% clear how the court would decide a case involving the agreement with Iran, but I think it moves in the wrong direction. And I can just tell you that the Arab Anti-Discrimination League applauded the decision, and most Jewish organizations have not applauded the decision. So the decision does not come out as a decision favorable to Israel. Now, the Supreme Court says that all it does is it reifies the neutrality that the United States wants to maintain in relation to Israel and the Palestinian Authority. But look,
we're back to that gap again.
The issue of Israel and peace will not be decided as a matter of law. Dean Acheson once said that no country's survival will ever be made a matter of law. So the end result will not be decided by the ICC. It will not be decided by the United States Supreme Court. It will not be decided by the Security Council of the United Nations. It will not be decided by the Israel Supreme Court. It will be decided politically and diplomatically by face-to-face negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority claims it wants land, claims it wants a change in the status quo. It cannot do that and refuse to negotiate. That's the ultimate fallacy in the position of the Palestinian Authority. You can't be demanding that Israel do something and refuse to sit down and negotiate with it about that something. And so my hope is that there will be negotiations, and that in my lifetime, and certainly in my granddaughter's lifetime, we will see shalom, shalom, real peace in the Middle East.
I'd like to thank you for being so enlightening and entertaining and bringing your granddaughter along to witness this.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.